Monday. On that note, welcome to the third edition of the world's largest FinTech Festival, the Global FinTech Fest 2022, organized by the National Payments Corporation of India, the Payments Council of India, and FinTech Governance Council. This edition of the fest is supported by the Department of Economic Affairs, the RBI, and the IFSCA. Before we start the session, ladies and gentlemen, it's only appropriate that we thank our partners, our theme partner WhatsApp, co-powered by partner Amazon Pay, spend management partner Encash, in association with partner Perfios, the payments partner Cash Free Payments, and the CEO's dinner partner HSBC. With that, we start the first session of the day, which is a panel discussion on the topic Evolving Regulatory Landscape, anticipating the role of Regtech and Septech. And to moderate this session, ladies and gentlemen, may I call upon Viswanath Krishnamurthy, the Chief Risk Officer, National Payments Corporation of India. He will be joined, welcome sir. He will be joined by Mr. Ravi Rajagopalan, who is the CEO Empays Payment Systems. Mr. Kunal Varma, the CEO and co-founder of Freo. Agneesh Banerjee, CBO DataSutram. Shekhar Bhandari, President Kotak Bank. And Ramesh Lakshminarayanan, CIO HDFC Bank. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Viswanath, you can take it from here.
Thanks, everyone. Pleasure having the co-panelists out here. Distinguished, everyone is distinguished in their respective fields. So before we jump into the topic, just thought that I'll give a brief overview and perspective. So as all of you are aware, the FinTech evolution has been really phenomenal. Worldwide, the FinTech space has been growing at a CAGR of about 27%. But in India, we are growing at a space of about 31%. It's very significant. And if you look at the investments which is coming in the FinTech space, again, we are kind of outperforming the rest of the world. While the average is about 63%, but in India, we are at around 87%, leading the space on this front. And so yesterday we have had the governor speaking that we have had more than about 100 unicorns coming out in the last 1 year from India. So that's a really good space to have. With so much happening on the FinTech space, it's also important that there is a regulatory oversight, which is definitely needed, and definitely RBI has been very active on that front. So quite a lot of things on the regulatory front has been happening, and the pace at which the regulatory directions and interventions are happening, whether the industry, be it fintechs or the banks, are they able to cope up with it, and definitely the non-compliance is viewed very severely, and we have seen RBI being very active and levying penalties and fines, etc. So that being the case, just want to get started with the panel members to just figure out how they are trying to manage this, their thoughts on that, and how investments in Regtech, which is basically technology needed to fulfill the regulatory requirements. And SUPTECH is basically technology for all supervisory requirements, which is mostly handled by the regulator. Just wanted to check with the panelists their thoughts, their views, and how we are going to approach this particular segment. So with that brief overview, let me start with Shekhar, right? So being a banker, Shekhar, you have the onerous task of meeting customer expectations, meeting the onerous task of customer expectations, and also at the same time the regulatory expectations. So how do you manage in your particular bank? How do you approach this ever-changing regulatory requirement, and how are you keeping pace with that?
So I think an excellent thought, an excellent part for all of us, where we stand, where regulations are supreme and customer experience becomes our motto of serving the customer. And balancing the two becomes the most important aspect at which I think we all are at the inflection point. You try to ensure that being a young bank, your systems are nimble, you are more razor sharp, more focused, and but overall as a banking industry, the systems would be, I call anarchic, traditional, not being able to talk to each other, the data from one system not being able to extract the way it can get and talk to other systems or other modes. And then I think the regulatory needs only increasing over a period. Why does I think regulatory needs increase over a period becomes a very important aspect for all of us. I think trust, safety and security becomes the epitome by which the regulators work with. And the evolving fintech, the evolving data, the evolving environment probably makes them, I think, a bit more cautious, a bit more concerned in terms of the trust, safety and security, I think, which they want to work on. As a bank, I think very happy to have I think good systems, a good data lake, good supervisory and control systems, I think, which is one been able to do. Since the systems are new, whether it is the core systems or the middle layer or the front layer, and they are able to talk to each other with a common data set, you generally find that the evolving regulatory landscape, you are able to probably, I think, adjust much better and able to comply much more. I'll give you a classic example that if you have an early warning signal on which you work on, and if you are able to have the entire external data sets and internal data of the customer, and you are able to marry the two, you are able to have one of the most robust risk management systems which is available for you. If you want to be on the trade side, you have a very similar amount of screening which is able to work on the internal databases and external databases. But is the situation same across the industry? I said I think different banks, there are few who have built systems over a couple of years, couple of decades, and yes, there is a significant difference in terms of agility with which they can work on.
Thank you, Shekhar. That was really insightful. Moving on, I'll just jump across to Ramesh. Interesting point which Shekhar touched upon about legacy systems, right? And also building up new systems for the new regulatory requirements which are coming up. How do you manage that in HDFC Bank? I'm sure that you've got a lot of traditional systems there, but bank of your scale, when you have to transform, you've also been extremely agile. How do you manage this complex process where you have to live with an existing system and also migrate to a new system, right? So,
I think it's a like Shekhar said, it's an evolving landscape. First of all, I think there are two aspects to this whole thing. Banks, and to my mind, actually, I'm just qualifying this that all banks are on legacy platforms. Okay, that's the fundamental thing. If you are on Oracle monolithic platform, you are dead. That is the reality of life. I'll give you an example. We spoke about early warning. Try and do a daily NPA on a single monolithic database. You know, the records will never get processed on a daily classification. So you need to think differently because that time has come because the size of the data and regulation today cuts across, right? I mean, if you have to look at an early warning, NPA, ADF reporting, and all of them on Regtech. I'm just taking from a Regtech space. I'm not talking from a regulatory angle of the entire ecosystem. Just the Regtech space, if you look at it, they need very different processing levels. I mean, you have billions of customers today, bank like us, and if you're trying to do a daily NPA on a single credit card across, just that itself is going to take time. And if you're trying to do on-prem monolithic platforms, it's not going to work. So I think for us, both from a Regtech system, even and from a normal system, the path to cloud is a given today. There is nothing that you can, and I find it very funny when some bank comes and tells we can still be on-prem. Actually, because I've been through this journey. I'm not saying from a a kind of a back-ended perspective. But you have to, because the data size and the volumes have gone up so much, right? So what we have done, the bank is, we have the same challenge like every other bank. So we've kind of now laid out the pipes to be able to move to new set of platforms. So as an example, we've done a very interesting concept of a landing zone, which is first in India, where our on-prem data center extends into the cloud data center. And we've done with all the clouds. We're very clear it's a multi-cloud hybrid architecture. But what we are doing is now, on top of it, you can bring in a series of new age platforms. So take an example, the entire NPA classification today runs on Spark engine, which is a very different way of kind of processing the entire flows, unlike the classical way of doing a RDBMS based processing, right? So I think what will happen, and this creates a nice pathway to interact with new set of players who are bringing, like I said, whether it's early warning, whether it's NPA management, whether it is ADF reporting, whether it is some of the other regulatory, even the information security side. I don't want to kind of dilute that, because a lot of regulatory aspects come from security angle, and a lot of those are coming up nicely in the new ecosystem. So you have to have a two-pronged strategy of kind of saying, how do you push the processing onto the new age platforms, and you continue to rewrite your legacy as time goes. So it's a balancing act, but I think it's an interesting, very interesting play out at this point of time. So.
Thanks, Ramesh. That will be definitely helpful for some of the big banks who are into the migration process. Because that's the constant today, right? So we have to keep migrating on the technology and keep upping it, right? So I'll just come to you, Ravi. So since you also have experience in running the network, how do you see the challenges surrounding data localization, and how do you think the ecosystem is able to take it? Do you think that there's a lot of work involved on that, or that's now more or less settled and it's doable? So that's one of the key requirements of the regulator, right?
So,
Yeah, it's on.
right. So good to be on the panel. Thank you very much to be in such a distinguished panel. I enjoyed the remarks made by Ramesh and Shekhar. So I'd like to preface that with a couple of observations, if I may. Right. So first of all, I think among all the G20 countries, India has had the fastest technology leap in the last 7 to 8, 10 years. And that is something that any one would struggle to cope with. So if we believe that our regulatory and compliance systems are not up to scratch because they're not able to cope with the pace at which things have evolved. And it was all credit to the NPCI, the government of India, the various ministries that have been involved in this. So I think that's something that we need to take into account. The second is that data localization, specific to your point, I think is done and dusted. I don't know if anyone is familiar with what happened to MasterCard last year. So there are very severe penalties to be paid if you flout if you flout the law. Admittedly, for global organizations like Visa and MasterCard, the difficulty is that it's not that they don't intend to comply. It is just that the systems are so complex that it is not possible to move systems from one geography to the other geography. So in MasterCard's case, the global settlement system, which is the heart of the business processing logic, was always run out of Purchase, New York, or St. Louis, Missouri. It's not possible to take that and copy it and put it in India. It's not a Word file or a PowerPoint file. So the thing is that it takes time to move those things, but I think from an Indian compliance, from an Indian regulatory and SUPTECH perspective, it is extremely important that as a significant major economy, that data relating to Indian transactions, Indian customers, Indian businesses are localized in India for the very reason that Ramesh just explained, that the natural migration of companies, of organizations is to go to cloud. You get out of legacy and go to cloud. The moment you go to cloud, the moment you virtualize, it is possible, it is easier, it's not one-on-one, but it is a lot easier to build the necessary hooks to make sure that you're able to get to a compliance perspective. The one country I'm aware of, which actually surprisingly has a very advanced SUPTECH infrastructure, is Rwanda. They actually dip directly from the bank's core banking systems. They pick up data on NPAs, they pick up data on loans processed and things like that. Admittedly, it's a small country and everything was built from scratch from the year 1998 after the recovery from, all the incidents that took place. But it is an example. The newer you are, the faster you are to comply with some of these things. So I look at data localization not as a nationalistic thing, because people confuse that, but in the evolving landscape that we are in, where we are changing at the pace at which we are changing, it is extremely important that we have the ability to localize Indian data and Indian customer data and Indian business data in India, so that SUPTECH becomes possible. And I see the big challenge only on the SUPTECH side, not so much on the Regtech side. Because the RBI today, and they will tell you themselves, Mr. Das will tell you himself, it is very hard for the RBI to keep pace with the way things are changing. They make a valiant effort. Those guys work very hard. We are a national payment system. We deal with the RBI on a daily or a weekly basis. They struggle. They work very, very hard. And the only way to make sure that this is not manpower dependent, because that is the danger with making everything, not talk to each other, is that there will be no SUPTECH in India. By the way, there are two examples of SUPTECH which already exist in the banking frame. Any import you make or any export you make, the forms that are necessary for that, including the shipping information, ultimately goes to compliance, goes to the RBI. So it is very, very hard to import without permits or to export without tax registrations done. They catch you in the end. So that, I think, is a good example of SUPTECH that exists in India, and that is possible because the data is in India.
Thanks, Ravi, for that. I think there's a lot of work which is happening on market surveillance by regulators such as RBI. And today, they get a lot of information at the click of a button, which was not there earlier. Even the reporting has been streamlined, I think, from the reporting requirements, which were earlier running into maybe a month or so. Now it's all happening within weeks. And so therefore, the regulator is able to identify the trends and do course correction quite quickly as well. Right, and also at the same time identify areas of non-compliance also that much more quickly. Yeah. So just moving on, Kunal, you represent a neobank, right? So how do you guys see the regulatory interventions and the need for Regtech? So do you think that this is an enabler, or do you think that it's a lot more painful? Of course, I think Ramesh was saying that it becomes easy for a new entrant to get onto the bandwagon quickly. But how has been your experience?
Sure. Thanks, Vish. Thanks for having me on the panel. So I think as a neobank, one key objective that we have is that, like everybody is speaking over here, the customer is very clear in terms of what value they want, right? So we are creating a digital banking platform because we think that's the way the future is going 10 years, 20 years from now. Digital is the way people want to consume services, right? So that's the fundamental need for the customer. So that doesn't change whether you look at it from a traditional bank perspective or a new neo-banking platform. And we have two brands, right? Freo is a consumer neobank, and at the same time we have MoneyTap, which is one of the largest credit line products. I think regulation has been, it has added complexity for us, which has forced us to invest time and effort, dedicated attention to putting things in place. But it's like solving the tough problems first. So it seems like it's like a first order negative situation where, you straight away go into like pain. Oh, I have to like solve 10 things. But I think it's been phenomenal because once you take that initial complexity or pain head on and solve it, after that we know that we are running it completely kosher. And that actually has also become beneficial because it manifests in form of trust. So when you operate with a clear eye and implementation on regulations, we have an NBFC license in that sense. We work very closely with banks and NBFCs. I think the trust from the customer side goes up because they know that you are a genuine product, genuine service, following regulation, following the law. The regulator looks at you as an entity that they understand because, again, you are following the regulatory aspects. And at the end of the day, it's a huge competitive advantage because there might be entities or organizations coming in and thinking, well, is there an arbitrage? Is there a regulatory arbitrage where I don't need to invest in regulation? I can circumvent it in certain ways and do something very quickly and be a challenger. So I think that is a very short-lived benefit. But anybody who's taking regulatory implementation head on, I think sees an advantage. So I think that's one aspect, which is it also is an enabler, it's a moat. I think referring to what Ramesh mentioned, legacy systems, and I'm an engineer, so I know and I understand technology and code, and I've done coding so much in my life, in my earlier life. I totally agree that, if you're starting something fresh, I think you have the ability to think first principles and think building scalable architecture for 10 years from now, 20 years from now, versus having a deal with systems, legacy systems or monolithic architectures. I think for us, it's easier when you start afresh, but take it first day onward, saying that, look, I need to think about regulation. I need to build a system which will adapt 10 years from now. So in some ways, it's easier than to go back and modify an existing system. But I think overall, if I were to sum it up, it's a lot of initial complexity. Any institution which is looking at building a long-term sustainable franchise, which wants to be around 10 years, 20 years from now, needs to invest upfront. And I think it adds value over a period of time. So I think that's how we've approached it overall, and it's benefited the customer at the end of the day.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you so much. Agneesh, moving on to you, I think you are rightfully sitting in the center of the panel. So the area of specialization that you work on is big data analytics, right? So it is definitely the center of the universe today, right? So how do you see that supporting this, this Regtech related, systems, and where you can play a better role on that, and how do you see banks utilizing big data analytics on this front? Your thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you so much, firstly, all of you, for having me here. And yeah, so my company, this company, we started out of our third year, I think, in college. Even I'm an engineer. So I was very interested into doing something different in the space of India. So being an alternate data company, I've had the honor and privilege to work with all kinds of institutions in the banking system, neobanks, traditional banks, etc. I think to start off with, whenever both parties, both sides of the coin, firstly, regulatory institutions like RBI, and the other one, financial institutions like traditional banks, neobanks, etc. Both parties, when they see the word Regtech, the common initial thought is, okay, then one more block, one more this, one more that. I think personally, as much as I've seen, Regtech and the use of big data analytics in this space can be extremely helpful, actually, to guide the way forward and to make sure that this boom of fintech and this boom in banking institutions as a whole in India that we're having, we have a very controlled boom now. It keeps on rising, but it's very controlled in the sense that risk goes down. Right now in India, and you guys will know this more than me here in this sense, that loans being handed out are much, much more in number, and ticket sizes are also much more. But having said that, risk has also increased that much, right? When you put in the advent of data, and when firstly, on one side, FIs, they use big data to understand customer behavior, to understand exactly what kind of loans are being handed out to them, why are they handing out to them, etc. Credit risk goes down by a lot, in my personal experience, that we have worked with banks and BFCs, etc. On the other side, when you take this entire Regtech conversation to RBI side, systems that they are trying to implement like CIMS, for example, or their public credit registry here in this case, yeah. So these systems that they're implementing as a whole, I feel this is creating a beautiful sandbox in the sense that newer companies and traditional banks as well can actually test out new tech, new advent on how to guide this way forward without implementing the risk that comes with the entire thing. So to me, I personally believe that yes, data is the new oil, And to me, I honestly feel that the advancements in Regtech that we are having as a whole, it's here for, the best for both sides. So if that is my
Agneesh,
2 cents on it.
I'll ask you one more leading question on that. So I'm sure you guys have worked on concepts such as NLP, RPA, and DLT, and those kind of things. Do you think that these things are really applicable in the RegTech world? And if yes, can you give us some examples on that front?
Sure. So in front of, everything that you just mentioned, is it applicable in the Regtech world? Yes. In one word, one short sense, yes. In the sense, again, I will just jump back to my previous conversation that I had, is that Regtech as a whole, from a humanistic approach, it creates a very, very subtle sense of empathy for both parties, right? So when you understand the behavioral patterns of these people, and when you understand exactly how to go about this entire landscape, you can you can control the boom likewise, making sure the risk goes down by that much. So yeah, I'll just keep it very short on that.
Thanks, yeah. Shekhar, I'll ask you probably one of the important questions. So it's more to do with how does the board look at some of these kind of things, right? Do they have oversight on the implementation of RegTech, and so do they look at? So are they really approving of investments which comes in this field, or the approach is let's go in a graded manner, let's wait and watch? How exactly do you take some of these conversations with the board? It'll be quite interesting for all of us to understand that and hear about that.
I can tell you, I think the bank boards are, I think, the best institutions which govern the way the bank is run. And this is, I'll say, for every bank. The reason being, you have a regulator which is on-prem for around 6 months and sees your entire data for 12 months. Has it on a monthly basis, and at times I think at much better frequency. The compliances which are expected of banks are good, and the ultimate responsibility resides with board. So yes, there are executives, but I think the board becomes, since they are the ones who run the company, they becomes most important. So from that point of view, I'll respect our boards for being, first is being aware, then being able to understand the implications of various things, including the technological developments which are happening, the requirements and regulations which is there, and the compliance with respect to same by banks and by the industry as a whole, at times the reasoning behind that. And in fact, it is compulsory for the bank board to get trained as well with respect to fraud, risk management, and solutioning. And I can tell you that they are the best regulators and judges internally before I think you get measured externally. I think coming to the data and the role of I think AI, ML, I think which you touched upon, I guess boards are very, very active in having those parts. SUPTECH doesn't happen only outside the bank. I think internally, I think the boards act as a SUPTECH, and your tech teams will generally be the Regtechs, which will be ensuring that you are able to meet the requirements of I think SUPTECH comes in. And I have seen, I think, this role only evolving over a period and going further, only to getting, I think, more enhanced. So example, the number of frauds which are happening and the customers which are not able to. So I think the board will be even directing on the CX side that I think educate the customer. So one is what is required regulatorily. Second is what even we need to do for the customer. There will be continuous advisory as well as monitoring on that. NPS becomes an important aspect where you generally focus on. I say that it is one of the ways you are able to have the entire regulatory aspect also taken care of. And third is the complaints, and I think what goes to ombudsman, etc., which gets reported. So from all angles, I guess I think boards becomes one is most efficient, effective, as well as knowledgeable SUPTECHs which are within the organization.
Thanks, Shekhar. I can completely resonate with that. So again, talking from an NPCI perspective, even our board is extremely active on some of these things. There's a separate complaints dashboard which is presented every time, and all the important projects related to regulatory requirements are separately tracked. So that's the kind of oversight which board has. Interesting point which you touched upon, Shekhar, on frauds, right? Ramesh, I'll just come to you on this. I know, and I think everyone in the room here knows that probably HDFC has one of the best fraud risk management numbers across across India, and in terms of being pioneers in that field. So to say, implementation of a lot of things such as PRM, which happened long back in 2005 or so, and others were looking at batch processing type of approach. Now again, I understand, since I'm privy to some of the developments in HDFC, that you're migrating from PRM into another system specifically for UPI, right? So I think when it comes to taking some of these kind of big decisions, so what do you look at when you look at a particular vendor? Do you go with the new technology, or you just go with the existing one because you're comfortable with that? Because at the end of the day, you have to get it first time right here, right? Whenever you get into any vendor for any of these kind of developments. So how do you manage this? It's a pretty complex ask. From outside, people see only the success, but internally you go through a very arduous task of right from vendor identification to ensuring that you get it right, and particularly when you embark on something really as big as a new system for UPI.
No, I think it kind of links to the question that you put forward. For example, fraud today can be only driven by AML. There is no other way for a size and scale at which banks like us operate. I mean, fundamentally, you can't put rules. The rules are good enough to that extent, but beyond that, it's kind of very different space now. So if you look at it the way, again, we do this more than, I think, looking at a solution, upfront, in terms of which vendor partner to look at, or what kind of, platform to look at. What is the design construct? Actually, you have to come back to the design construct. Take UPI is a good example that you get fraud. The way UPI frauds have to be managed is extremely different from any other kind of. So take simple example, just kind of elaborating, because UPI is quite hot topic and the number of transactions are very different, right? So today, if you look at it, UPI fraud monitoring starts right at the device level. I mean, that's the first point of port of call. You are actually inside the device of the customer. So that's where it starts. So it starts with fundamental stuff like, can your app be completely compliant? Can it be kind of skimmed up and kind of replicated and all of that stuff. Then there is a series of signals that come in, like you said, whether it's in terms of geolocation, IP, type of phone, so many of the other signals that come in. That's basically the adaptive authentication, and you have to really adapt to that, right? I mean, today the big techs, for all the wrong things, they do this very well at scale, right? Every time there's a small change in your behavioral pattern on your iPad, you are immediately kind of prompt up. In fact, banks used to do that. HDFC was one of the first banks that used to do step-up authentication, if you remember, much earlier than that, right? But the game has changed significantly. The kind of behavioral patterns you're looking is very, very different, right? From the way you operate a keyboard to the way you kind of look at it. Then comes the transaction monitoring, which is the correlation, and that's a very different game today. And I'll give you a simple example today. Earlier, you just could do a simple transaction velocity check and you will be happy with it. I mean, simple stuff, debit, credits happening beyond a certain velocity, simple rules to play with. Today, the game has so much changed that you are in a situation where you have to look at the kind of patterns of the fraud. You get things like, first a mule account would be opened, on a credit side. So it's a credit account, and the transaction monitoring is happening on the debit side. So an AML system, effectively, that's onboarding, and the transaction monitoring system have to speak to each other. Otherwise, your fraud management cannot be complete. So what we normally follow nowadays, and that's the change that we are doing, is we first looking at the entire process end to end, saying where are the linkages, and then the behavioral linkage. And then you get an ecosystem of solutions, so to say. So it's bit like first you get your house ready in terms of what you want, then the technology is a mirror. So there are platforms to look at adaptive authentication, there are platforms to look at behavioral biometrics, there are other platforms to look at transaction monitoring. It still doesn't end. Then the credit teams then need to stitch it together to be able to really then fine tune. And that's the knowledge, to my mind, that's the biggest pain area. More than the tech solutions, the fundamental knowledge that the risk management and fraud management teams carry over a period of time and how that gets codified into the platform. I think, and those are the parameters in which, so we are, for example, of the entire new system that you spoke about, we are completely looking at from this angle, saying how do I link up all these dots and basis my knowledge base of last 25 years, how do we then bring that into a modern platform, and then you start narrowing down on false positives and really go after the cases that you look at. And that is true for every Regtech project today. That's the real. Regtech projects have become, in fact, if you ask me, they're the most AI/ML-led projects today. People, we tend to look at it more the marketing and the cross-sell and all that. But in banks, risk management and Regtechs are the fundamental, users of modeling actually, and various kinds of modeling. So I think the space is far more, I think, changing in this area. In fact, the adoption is far, because the need is there. Unlike in a marketing space, which is very crowded, you can get hundreds of platforms. Here, in the sharper focus, the ability to have a domain knowledge is also very critical. So it's a very evolving space to my mind. And like I said, never put the solution in front of a platform or a product, but go with the process and then you construct a solution. That's how we're looking at this whole ecosystem.
Thank you, Ramesh. That was really helpful. I think we are really running out of time. Maybe I just ask one question to Ravi, and with that, after that, we can probably open up to the audience for any questions. So Ravi, I'm sure you also work very closely with the regulators, and at NPCI we also do. So one thing which the regulators has always been thinking on is to look at how can they have a diagnostic approach, a predictive approach, and followed by a prescriptive approach, right? So how do you think today's regulators are enabling themselves on this front, by using technology?
So the problem is that everyone is in catch-up mode, right? And it helps if some of these things are thought of when we, build things. So we run a national payment system. We were able to design it from scratch. So a lot of the Regtech part of it we were able to build in. But that is now 7 or 8 years old. And actually the technology has moved on. In 7, 8 years, tech has moved on completely. When we built it, people used to look askance at us at putting it in a tier 4 data center instead of our own office. Tumhara server kahan hai? They used to ask us. And now they don't do that anymore. But now if you go to a bank and say we are in a tier 4 data center, but we are not, they say, no, but where is your AWS strategy? Where is your Azure strategy? Where is your Google strategy? So I think the same thing is happening on the regulator side. My experience with the Reserve Bank of India is that I think they are unfortunately in catch-up mode most of the time. It is very rarely that new payment products get built. Like UPI is a great example. We built one, the IMT system. There's another one that we are building, where we have now managed to work with the regulatory and compliance organizations and the banks that we work with to try and make sure that some of these queries are put into place. The problem is the quality of data, right? Especially for prescriptive, call-outs to say that, predictive call-outs where there is a possibility that something could go wrong and there is an alert mechanism built in. I think that most systems are unfortunately woefully inadequate for that. And to the point that you raised earlier about NLP, that's where you need to look at unstructured data to try and see if you can come up with some kind of a predictive method. Like, Twitter feeds, social media feeds, WhatsApp feeds, you need to be able to look at that in terms of interested parties to try and predict. I think in a mechanistic environment like payment systems generally are, where it is quite predictive, prediction is less of an issue. But where it is more open-ended, like when you're lending, where you're onboarding customers, there it is you need to do something more unstructured. And I don't think there is any regulator let alone the Reserve Bank of India, who is prepared for a predictive approach on how to generate alerts on this.
Thank you, Ravi. That was really interesting. While always the approach has been to have a to always been an approach of catching up, right? But I still feel that amongst most of the regulators today, the RBI has been really active and in the forefront, right? While some of the regulations which they come out are really thought through, and they do a lot of industry engagement as well. I think we are completely out of time. Probably we might have. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thank you, gentlemen, for that insightful session. In fact, some really interesting points coming out of the panel this morning. Shekhar spoke about the fact that trust, safety, security is key, and how legacy and new systems should feed off each other. Ramesh spoke about the need to think differently, and how stitching together the available intelligence is as important as creating new ones. Ravi spoke about the fact that the evolving landscape, localizing Indian data is key for SUPTECH to gravitate to the next phase. Kunal spoke about the fact that regulation has added complexity, but it has been beneficial as it manifests as trust, which the customer ultimately wants. Agneesh spoke about the importance of a controlled boom and the creation of a sandbox that helps the ecosystem to use it to their advantage. So really interesting points coming off the panel this morning. Unfortunately, we are short of time, so we will not be taking any questions. Apologies for that. But thank you, gentlemen, and take care of yourselves. Have a great day ahead.